Thank you so much, Greg, and welcome everybody who's tuned into the webinar. I really hope that this first part in our series of 3 is really useful to you. Just some background on myself. My name is Kylie. I am a beef extension officer here in the gorgeous Rockhampton in central Queensland. And I do a lot of work with graziers, either managing pastures and supplements and nutrition of cattle. So I'm going to talk about nutrition today, and I really hope it is helpful to you. This is what we are going to cover in this 3-part series talking about nutrition in cattle. So today I am going to talk about practical cattle nutrition. So pre-warning, this is not a presentation or a course that's going to teach you really detailed things about rumen function or the anatomy of a digestive system or anything really technical or complicated like that. It's going to be really practical so that hopefully you can put some of these things into practice on your own property. I'm going to talk a little bit about limiting nutrients because that's very important to understand when we're working out what to supplement cattle with when. Of course, I'll talk about legumes. It's one of my favourite topics, but it is very, very important in the nutrition of grazing cattle. And then we'll talk a bit about pasture intake, and that's all about cattle having enough feed to actually fill their belly every day. That's my sort of nutrition fundamentals that I'll cover today. And then next week you will hear from Mick Sullivan, and he's going to talk more about herd management and nutrition, so how you can manage breeders and time of calving, time of weaning, that type of thing. And then the week after that, again, on the 15th of September, you'll have Mick again, and he'll be talking about how you actually choose and manage your supplements. So the ingredients in different supplements and how you work out what's going to be most cost effective to you. Before I start, I will just alert you to a bunch of online resources that are super handy in this sort of nutrition space and also around drought. These are all free websites and information to access. Most of them are government run or associated in some way. The FutureBeef website here on the top left, I will talk a lot about FutureBeef today because that's where we have a lot of resources that are available for graziers to access afterwards. And then the other resources here are about sustainability grants or loans or subsidies, financial services, climate services, and things around drought. There are also some really handy resources that you can access either in a paper form or you can download from the FutureBeef website. The first two on the left, the Weaner and the Phosphorus books, we like to call them, they're produced by MLA in conjunction with DAF and our Northern Territory and Western Australian government departments. They are great resources. I use them personally all the time, and they're really easy to read and follow. This one here in the middle, if you can see my pointer, is part of a body of work where there was some great economics work done around not only building wealth to help people be more resilient to drought, but also some drought management strategies, all from an economic perspective. So there's some great tools on the FutureBeef website associated with that work. This fantastic book here has just been re-released. Some of you might have seen it before. It used to be a beautiful little A5 book. It's just been revamped and it is on the FutureBeef website, free to download. Now that book there will have all the information that Mick and I are talking about over the next 3 weeks, plus more. It's going to be your best resource to manage the nutrition of cattle in the dry season. And then the last one I'll draw your attention to is our Fit to Load guide, which is incredibly important, particularly if you are moving animals that you think might be a bit light in body condition or have been having a bit of a tough time. We all have a responsibility to load animals in the correct manner and the correct animals that are fit for transport. So definitely make sure you've got one of these guides in your glove box of the truck. The FutureBeef website, like I said, it's got lots of great information. There is a web page dedicated entirely to phosphorus nutrition. Now, I will talk about phosphorus nutrition today briefly, but it is a whole topic on its own. So this website here, you can visit, or this web page on the FutureBeef site. Mick and I wrote this a couple of years ago, and then we update it every year after we run more phosphorus workshops and help more people with phosphorus supplementation. It's got a lot of great resources on it, including webinars and some resources that you can download it that are very specific to phosphorus. So that's where you can go for more information on phosphorus. If you're in central or southern Queensland, there are some free workshops that are coming up in the next few months that we will be delivering. And these are sort of snappy half-day workshops that are going to cover what we do in these webinars, but also in a little bit more detail and a bit more personalized to your specific situation and what's happening on your property. So they are all on the FutureBeef calendar. If you want to attend one of those, they're free. You just register, and it means you can cover a lot of this information we're doing in the webinars, but more specific for your situation. Okay, now we'll talk about the fundamentals of cattle nutrition, or sort of nutrition 101 as we like to call it. The first thing I want to talk about is a food pyramid. Our cattle have a food pyramid just the same way humans do, and it's a relatively simple concept in that the top of our food pyramid, or the widest part of our food pyramid, are the things that are the most important to nutrition. These components are absolutely essential. If you don't have what's here in the widest part of our pyramid, there is no point in worrying about everything that comes down to the smaller pointy part of our food pyramid. So for cattle, at the top of their food pyramid, the most important component is energy, or metabolizable energy. Then we move on to crude protein, and then we get into what are called our macro and micronutrients, and that's these ones here at the bottom of our pyramid. Now, I've pulled out phosphorus and sulfur on their own because I will talk about them in a bit more detail today. Phosphorus is the most common mineral deficiency that we see in Northern Australia, and sulfur can be a problem in certain situations. There certainly could be deficiencies in some of these other micronutrients from time to time, and I'll talk about that in a second, but it's relatively uncommon. Now, just some units or abbreviations for you to get you familiar with them. So when we talk about metabolizable energy, we abbreviate that to ME, and that's the type of thing that you'll see on your supplement labels. And Mick will talk about supplement labels in a couple of weeks' time. Now, ME is measured in megajoules per kilogram of dry matter, and that's important when you're looking at supplement labels. What I will talk a bit about today is this thing called dry matter digestibility. Now, that's abbreviated to DMD, and it's a percentage. And what that is that's a measure of how much energy and also how digestible a plant is in relation to what it provides for the diet of cattle. So I'll talk about DMD in a second. Crude protein, we abbreviate to CP. Again, you'll see that on supplement labels. It's always a percentage. And then you'll also hear Mick and myself talk about nitrogen and urea. Now, we are always talking about nitrogen and urea in relation to the crude protein that they help provide for a grazing beast. Nitrogen and urea themselves are not crude protein, but they contribute to crude protein in the diet. Phosphorus, we abbreviate to a P, and quite often in just everyday language, I will use P. So be aware that that's what I'm talking about, and it's a percentage. Sulfur is the same, we abbreviate it to S, and it is a percentage as well. So just remember, like I said, what we have at the top, or the widest point of our food pyramid, is what cattle need the most of. It's the most critical components of nutrition. And then at the pointy end of our pyramid is what cattle need the least of. So at the bottom of our food pyramid, we have vitamins and minerals, and they're split into two groups, so macronutrients and micronutrients. So we have basically macro minerals and micro minerals in the diet of cattle. Now, we do talk to a lot of graziers who are worried about deficiencies in these types of minerals, and the thing is, apart from phosphorus, it's relatively uncommon to have a deficiency in one of these things. There are certain situations where the environment or the climate or an animal's metabolic state might lead to a deficiency in one of these minerals, but it's fairly uncommon. So some examples might include, there's an area sort of north of Charters Towers on basalt country that can have a sulfur and a sodium issue. Likewise, sulfur can be a problem if cattle are grazing a lot of mulga. In central Queensland, we have some marine plains where copper can sometimes be an issue, but these are very unique circumstances. And for the average grazing bovine out there eating pastures, most of these macro or micronutrients are never going to be a problem or be impacting production for cattle. Like I said, phosphorus we pull out on its own, and I'll talk about that a bit more in a second. And phosphorus is a macronutrient, so that's something that cattle need in grams every day. They need a lot of, whereas micronutrients, these ones on this list here, are what cattle need a very, very small of every day. So they need 1/100th of what they might need of these macronutrients, or 1,000, sorry. And then our vitamins here on the right, like I said, it's relatively uncommon to have a deficiency in a vitamin. Most of the vitamins that cattle need either come from the environment, like vitamin D, for example, comes from the sun. The pasture provides most other vitamins, things like vitamin A and C and E and K, they all come from pasture. And then our B vitamins are actually synthesized in the rumen by the bugs in the rumen. So it's pretty uncommon to have a deficiency in one of these. When we talk about the cattle food pyramid with our components at the top that are most important, we then move on to a concept called the most limiting nutrient. And what that means is there will be times of the year where some of these nutritional components are limiting to cattle production. And unless we address the limiting nutrient first, there's no point in addressing the other nutrients. So this kind of graphic I've got here will help explain that concept. So what we have here, if you can picture it, is kind of like a concrete water trough or a concrete tank. And imagine that the front of the tank is made up of 4 panels, one for metabolizable energy, one for crude protein, one for phosphorus, and then one for our other vitamins and minerals. Now, if you have enough of all of these components and you were to try and fill that tank, you would fill it to the top. But what happens when we talk about limiting nutrients, it starts to happen in the dry season for most cattle. So early in the dry season, what happens is the grass starts to run out of protein before it runs out of anything else. So in the early dry season, if we were to try and fill this tank, our most limiting nutrient would be crude protein. We can correct that a little bit with supplementation of a nitrogen source. So that's something like urea or Gran Am. But what we do is we only patch that limiting nutrient a little bit. So you can see in this situation here, if you were to feed cattle more energy, up over here, you wouldn't really have any effect on the nutrition of the animal because we're actually limited by how much crude protein is in the diet. As we move into the late dry season, energy starts to become limiting. So not only do we have a limit in protein, we have a limit in energy as well. So if we were to try and fill this tank, we're actually limited or restricted by both of those nutrients. Now we can try and patch that up a little bit by feeding an energy source. So molasses is the most common energy source that most people would use. And if we're giving more energy, we can give a bit more protein as well, and we can start to fill that gap a little bit. The problem is that we can never fully fill it unless we spend a lot of money to supplement cattle with. And that type of money is things like grain and hay. So what we need to do is make sure our breeders in particular have enough body reserves to help fill that gap for themselves. What happens on phosphorus deficient country is quite different to what we've just seen in the dry season. So phosphorus deficient country, there is not enough phosphorus in the soil, and I'll talk more about that in a second, but in the wet season, phosphorus is a problem on deficient country. So when it rains and we've got beautiful green grass, we've got lots of energy and lots of protein in the grass, but we don't have enough phosphorus because there's no phosphorus in the soil on that deficient country. So what's limiting for us on phosphorus deficient country in the wet season is phosphorus. We can patch that a little bit with a phosphorus source. So the most common phosphorus sources that people use would be MDCP or DCP. And we can get pretty close to filling that phosphorus gap for most cattle. There's always going to be a couple of cattle that we may not meet it for exactly, but phosphorus is something we can do a pretty good job of filling that gap for. So that kind of explains the concept of most limiting nutrient. And that's why as I go through now and talk about some of these nutrients in more detail, it helps to understand why we focus so heavily on energy and protein. So talk about energy first. And like I said, energy it's at the top of our food pyramid, is the most important thing for cattle production. This is what drives live weight gain, so kilograms of beef every day. And this is the main component or nutrient that cattle will get from grass. So foragers, like I said, we measure their energy with this term called dry matter digestibility. So a forage or plant material that has a high dry matter digestibility means, one, it's got more energy in it, and two, it means cattle can eat more of it because it's highly digestible. So if we've got a forage source that's got a high DMD, it means it provides lots of energy and cattle can eat lots of it. Now that energy consumption really depends on what we're looking at in the pasture and then what animals are eating it. So the pasture intake can depend on the live weight of the animal or the size of the animal, because a bigger animal has a bigger maintenance requirement to start off with before we even consider things like growth. the status of the animal. So of course, a lactating cow will have a much higher intake requirement than a dry cow. And then, like I said, the quality of the pasture really impacts how much pasture cattle can eat. So on tropical pastures, we're looking at daily intakes of somewhere between about 1.5 and 2.4% of an animal's body weight. So that's dry matter pasture intake every day. Now, to give you an idea, in maybe like a feedlot diet, we're looking at cattle eating maybe somewhere between 2.7 and 3% of their body weight. So our tropical pastures don't provide the same quality diet as a feedlot does, of course, but pushing about 2.4 or 2.5% of the body weight is very good for a tropical pasture. So if you have a look at these photos I have here on the right, you can see that the steer in the Lacuna paddock on the top that's got green Lacuna and green grass, his pasture intake or intake of pasture in Lacuna is going to be quite high. He's probably going to be getting close to that 2.4% every day. Whereas this fella down here who's got dry grass and a bit of Lacuna, his intake will be a fair bit lower. It'll still be pretty high for dry season though, because he's got the beautiful green leaf of the Lacuna to eat as well. Leads me to talk a bit about legumes, and I'm going to talk in more detail about them in a couple of slides' time. But something that we need to remember about legumes, and a lot of people know that legumes provide protein to the diet of cattle, but the most important thing they provide is energy. Legumes are full of energy, and that can really affect pasture intake for the positive. Protein is the next component that we move on to in our limiting nutrients. So protein is really important because it actually feeds the microbes that are in the rumen that then digest the grass for the cattle. And what happens is as we move through the dry season, protein becomes more and more limiting. And that means that there is a reduction in the feed source for those rumen microbes. It means they've got a lower capacity to digest grass. And that means that the cow itself eats less grass. So what we can do is we can provide a nitrogen source to those rumen microbes. So that would be urea or sulfate of ammonia or Gran Am. And that provides nitrogen to those microbes and it helps them eat more grass. But this is a trick or a thing that we use, a tool that we use in the dry season all the time is urea feeding. Now, urea can really make a big difference to how an animal will travel over the dry season because we actually enable them to eat more grass. The critical thing about urea feeding is that you must be able to do it safely, of course, but second of all, you need to make sure there's a lot of dry feed in front of those cattle. There's no point in feeding urea if there is no body of dry feed for cattle to be able to eat. If we feed urea, we can increase pasture intake somewhere between 10 and 30%, so you need to be able to make sure you've got enough grass that will last. I've just got one little slide here on sulfur because it's a unique sort of situation where sulfur might be an issue. So like I said earlier, there are some areas of Queensland where sulfur can be a problem, like north of Charters Towers on the basalt country, but the biggest sulfur problem really is in the mulga country in southwest Queensland. And that's because when cattle eat a lot of mulga in their diet, they actually become deficient in sulfur. And that's simply because mulga, the mulga tree or the leaves of the mulga tree actually have very little sulfur in them at all. And sulfur is really important to those rumen microbes, and if they don't get it, feed intake can really be reduced. So if we look at this little diagram on the bottom here, the blue arrow here is, or the blue line is about how much mulga is in the diet of cattle. So if there's a little bit of mulga in the diet, it means there'll be a little bit or a low amount of sulfur in the diet. But when we have a lot of mulga in the diet, we actually become deficient in sulfur. So if you are in mulga country in southwest Queensland or maybe northwest New South Wales, or maybe even South Australia, it's really important to have sulfur in your supplement if you have cattle eating mulga. Phosphorus is the only other mineral that I'm going to talk about, and I'll talk a little bit more about phosphorus because it's such an important thing and it can really impact production if you're on phosphorus deficient country. So this map here on the left is a map of Queensland, and it shows you where country is likely to be either deficient, which is the red, marginal, which is yellow, or green, adequate in phosphorus. Now this map exists actually for the whole of Northern Australia, so it covers Queensland, Northern Territory and Western Australia. I've just got Queensland here at the moment. But you can see how extensive those red areas are. So phosphorus deficiency is a really big problem in Northern Australia, and it's something that can be fairly easily fixed for a really good production and economic benefit. Now, when we talk about deficient soils, we talk about how much phosphorus is in them. So the first thing to note is the type of soil phosphorus test that you might get if you were doing soil testing. And you need to be looking for this Colwell P or the bicarbonate extractable P. And if you get a phosphorus measurement in ppm or milligrams per kilo, that's what you can relate to this scale here. So this scale here, so deficient is our red in the map, but I've actually put another category in here that we use a lot, which is acutely deficient. And you can see that's very little phosphorus in the soil at all. So there's big areas that are deficient or acutely deficient in phosphorus, and we know that if we feed phosphorus, we can alleviate a lot of problems for our cattle. The phosphorus deficiency for cows is a big problem, and that is basically because when cows lactate, they lose a lot of phosphorus in their milk. So if we don't replenish that for them, they've got no other way of replenishing their own phosphorus stores, because remember, our soil has very little phosphorus in it, which means the grass doesn't have any in it either. So what happens when cattle are deficient in phosphorus? The very first thing that happens is their pasture intake is reduced. And the easiest way to describe this is the same as if you or I, we're a bit under the weather, we might have the flu or something like that. The first thing we do is we probably skip the next meal. We probably don't eat, or we don't eat as much because we don't feel great. Well, cattle are exactly the same. So when they're phosphorus deficient, their pasture intake reduces. And for a cow, that's a huge problem because it has a direct effect on her body condition. And we know that body condition is so important to all of these other biological processes. You may have seen some signs of phosphorus deficiency before. There are some really sort of obvious signs in really deficient country, things like peg leg, which is a bone deformity. You might see cattle that break bones in head bales and crushes, things like that. You could even see cows that are chewing bones, and they chew bones because bones have phosphorus in them, of course. But the thing that we see most commonly when we're working with people in cattle nutrition is just a reduction in production. So you don't have to see really severe signs of deficiency to actually have a deficiency. Now, like I said, a deficiency in phosphorus has a really bad long-term effect on cows because they mobilize phosphorus. And what that means is that when cows are lactating and producing milk, they actually pull phosphorus out of their bones into their bloodstream to make milk. It's amazing. All mammals do it, humans do it as well. And the problem is that if those cows can't replenish those stores, there's big problems for the rest of their life, basically. So these are the things that we see when we have big phosphorus deficiency. So this first one here is reduced conception. Now that is directly related to body condition. Also reduced weaning rate. So not only do cows have trouble getting pregnant, they might have trouble actually producing that calf and bringing it back into the yards as a weaner for you. They have reduced milk production, which of course affects the growth of calves and therefore the size of the weaners. It really increases their chance of dying, and that's because they struggle to maintain body condition. So those cows that can't maintain body condition easily, they're the first ones that are going to be in trouble in a dry season, which increases their chances of dying. And then the other thing that really starts to hurt your hip pocket is, when you've got empty cows and they can't put on weight quickly, you end up with a much lower cull cow weight at the meatworks. Now, all of these things really affect the profitability of a business, and there's another body of work that has actually looked at the economics of phosphorus supplementation, and I can tell you now, if you're on deficient country, it's well worth your while to start supplementing with phosphorus to fix some of these problems, because the payback period on what you would spend on supplementation is very quick, and it's a very good business decision. In growing cattle, we basically see this something similar to cows, except without all of the reproductive and lactation effects, and the main effect is just low growth rates. It's all related to that body condition issue, which is to do with pasture intake. So you'll find on phosphorus deficient country, if you don't supplement steers with phosphorus, or if you don't put your steers on the better country, you'll have low growth rates in the steers and also your growing heifers. There's been some really fantastic work that has been published in the last couple of years, particularly out of the University of Queensland, which has told us more about phosphorus than we've ever known before. And some of the work is really, really interesting in terms of how we actually supplement cattle with phosphorus. And what we now know from that research is that when cattle come from phosphorus adequate country or an adequate phosphorus diet and then move to a deficient diet, so they might move to poorer country, it takes somewhere around 6 weeks for those signs of phosphorus depletion to start happening. So they have a bit of a buffer time before they really start to feel the effects of the deficiency. The amazing thing is, though, when you start to supplement cattle who are deficient with phosphorus, they can start to replete phosphorus in a matter of days. It is so amazing, these animals, what they can do with phosphorus. So the good news is if you're on deficient country and you hadn't been supplementing with phosphorus, if you get in and start doing it, you'll start to see a benefit pretty quickly. So what we know about steers in terms of phosphorus repletion and depletion, we can extrapolate over to cows once cows are weaned. Now that's the critical thing. If a cow still has a weaner sucking milk out of her, she's still losing phosphorus. So weaning is really critical in phosphorus management. Mick's going to talk about a bit about that next week. But in terms of repletion of phosphorus for cows, remember they need to replete so much more phosphorus because they've mobilized a heap out of their bones to produce milk, particularly if they've had a long lactation. And the amazing thing about cows is that they can actually start to replete phosphorus even in the dry season when things are tough. So if you're on deficient country, it's really worth your while investigating some phosphorus supplementation. And these are some of the benefits of supplementation. So on phosphorus deficient country, if you start to feed phosphorus and get the right amount of phosphorus into those animals, we can see feed intake increase somewhere between 10 and 60%. Now I know that seems like a pretty big range, and of course that really depends on the quality of pasture that's available as well. But the message is that you will get an increase in pasture intake. And that leads on to all these other things. So increased live weight, you decrease the chances of breeders dying. So that's a good effect on breeder mortality. You increase weaning rates as well as weights. So it's a very important thing, phosphorus, if you're on deficient country. Now we've talked about the 4 sort of main components of cattle nutrition. So energy, protein, phosphorus, and sulfur. This little table here just kind of broadly summarizes the forage sources that a cow might have and then how much energy, protein, phosphorus, and sulfur she would get from them. So at the top of the table here, I've got grass because that is most of what most cattle are eating all the time. So grass provides a dry matter digestibility of somewhere between 45 to 60%. So in the wet season, we're looking closer to 60%. In the dry season, we're down towards 45. Now, crude proteins are pretty big range as well. So 4 is, of course, the depths of the dry season. Grass doesn't provide very much phosphorus if you're on phosphorus deficient country, but grass provides plenty enough sulfur for cattle. Herbage and legumes I've put in one group here. So herbage might be some of the beautiful winter herbage that grows in Western Queensland when there's some winter rain, but legumes would be all of our pasture legumes. Now you can sort of put into this category as well some forage crops, like forage oats would probably fit in here as a C3 cereal that we feed to cattle. And you can see that the DMD range of the herbage and the legumes provides much higher DMD than grass. It can still be a little bit low, but it can be very high. Now, forage oats can actually be higher than 70%. It can be up around 80%, but not everybody feeds forage oats. Crude protein is a pretty big range as well. Now, that 30% here is definitely our beautiful winter herbages in Western Queensland, but also all of our legumes provide crude protein, usually somewhere above 20% all year round. And legumes provide enough phosphorus and enough sulfur, so they really are the best feed that we can give to cattle. And I've just put mulga in at the bottom line here to cover our folks in Western Queensland. So mulga itself has very low dry matter digestibility. It's the same as grass in the dry season. And the protein can be a bit higher in mulga, but the problem is it's not all digestible. That's really important to remember when you're feeding mulga. And mulga also has very little phosphorus and very little sulfur. So you can see from this table here, legumes really are what's going to provide the best quality feed for cattle all year round. So I kind of like to talk about legumes as our natural supplement. It's what nature gives us, so we don't have to feed cattle. They're pretty amazing plants, and like I said earlier, they are not only a source of protein, which most of us know about, but they're a very big source of energy. And when you have a legume grass pasture, if cattle are eating a lot of legumes, they're getting a lot of extra energy for live weight gain, and that's really important to understand. We know from a lot of the grazing trials that we've done here at DAF that if you have a well-managed legume grass pasture, you can produce a lot more beef per kilogram, kilograms of beef per hectare per year compared to a grass-only system. They allow for higher stocking rates, higher daily live weight gain, and longer grazing periods. They really are a superior pasture system. And they're very profitable. They can easily make you a lot of money, but management is key. It's very, very important. And this example that I'm going to show you here will help explain that. Now, this set of data here was collected as part of a forage project, and it's a Legume paddock that was monitored for 12 months. Now, I know not everyone listening today will have Legume on their property or access to Legume, or you might not be in the right environment to plant Legume. I'm just using this as an example of a legume grass system. It just happens that we measured a lot of Legume, so it's the easiest data set for me to show you, but the same thing can occur in a stylo pasture, for example, or a desmethus pasture, any type of legume pasture. So these cattle that we measured here were steers and heifers, and this was in the 2013-14 year. This is the graph. It's a little bit complicated, so I'll talk you through it. So on the left-hand side here in the blue, we have crude protein percent. And there'll be a blue line that pops up on this graph, which is the crude protein we've measured in the diet of these grazing cattle. On the right-hand side, we have green, which is the Legume in the diet, and that will relate to this green line that will pop up. So these measurements for diet, we've actually got from measuring the feces of these grazing cattle. The red line across the top is just the grazing period. So you can see nearly the entire year was grazed apart from a little break here and a little break here. And then, of course, we've got the dates across the bottom, so 2013 to 14. Now, I originally had on this graph a line that showed you the quality of the Legume that was in this paddock. So we actually measured the Legume leaf, and anyway, it looked a bit too messy, so I took it off. But the average crude protein in the Legume all year round, no matter what season it was 23% crude protein. So you don't have to worry about the quality of the protein of the Legume. It's very high all the time. So I'm going to talk you through stage by stage. So this is the first period that we monitored. And you can see some photos here of what the paddock looked like. So when cattle went on the paddock, there's lots of grass, lots of Legume. That's a very big biomass of Legume. And then after 76 days, you can see there's not a lot left. So cattle basically crash grazed this paddock. This is a 76-day period, and cattle only put on about 0.5 kilo a day. And these lines down here help explain it. So our blue line is the crude protein we've measured in the diet. So when cattle went on the paddock, we measured over 15% crude protein in the diet, which is pretty high, but you can see it crashes pretty quickly and then goes down here and actually sits below 10%, which is quite low for a Legume paddock, very low actually. Now that line you can see mirrors exactly what we've measured as the diet Legume. So if we read across to this scale here, we can see that when cattle went on the paddock, they were eating more than 80% of their diet as Legume. But they grazed it out really quickly, and that crashed down to somewhere around about 40%. So you can see the crude protein in the diet is directly influenced by the amount of Legume in the diet. And because it was crashed out so quickly, that's why this weight gain isn't very high. Now this next period is pretty interesting. Have a look at this weight gain here. We only measured just above maintenance, so about 0.2, 0.3 kilograms per head per day, which is incredibly low for a Legume paddock. And this is why. We can see the amount of Legume in the diet increases. It's up to above 70%. And you might think, wow, that's really high amount of Legume in the diet. Why aren't they putting on weight? You can see here, though, the crude protein in the diet is still pretty low. And the reason is, if we look at the photo, even though cattle are eating a lot of their diet as Legume, they actually can't eat enough Legume or enough grass or anything to put on more weight. All they can manage is a 0.29 kilograms per day. So the message in this little time period here is that cattle actually couldn't fill their bellies. And at the end here, things look a little bit messy, but what happens is we have a little break in the grazing here. There's a little bit of rain. Have a look at our paddock. It grew some more Legume leaf. So the amount of Legume in the diet spikes back up to somewhere around 80%. The crude protein in the diet spikes up. So what are we at here? Maybe about 15%. So it's pretty high again. And what happened is once cattle could eat enough Legume in their diet and actually fill their belly, they had what we call compensatory gain, and that explains that really high weight gain of 0.9 kilograms per day. So to summarize what we saw here in this first period, what we can see is that the amount of legume in the diet really influences the diet quality. So when we had 80% of the diet as Legume and cattle could fill their belly, we had a high diet crude protein. The next period, though, shows us that intake's really important. So even though we had a high amount of Legume in the diet, cattle actually couldn't eat enough every single day to keep that weight gain high. And the third period here tells us what compensatory gain is. So when cattle have a low growth rate, like this 0.29, and then they're provided with better and more nutrition, they actually compensate and they grow really fast. Moving on now to talk a bit more about intake. This is the last example that I'm going to show you. So in this example here, we're talking about a breeder in the dry season. So talking about a 450 kilo cow. Now, if she's in the middle of the dry season, she might be faced with some pasture that has a really low crude protein and a really low DMD. So at that DMD, she would only be able to eat about 1.5% of her body weight. So this example here is going to show you what the dry season looks like for this girl. Now, if she was eating only pasture and she's eating 1.5% of her body weight, if you do those calculations, that equals about 7 kilograms of grass every day. Now, that 7 kilograms will provide her with just over 40 megajoules of energy and just over 300 grams of protein. And I've got a photo here of what that looks like. So this little blurry photo here is me. I'm only about 160 centimeters tall. I'm not very tall, but you can see this big pile of dry grass in front of me. It's actually been weighed. That is 7 kilos of dry grass. So that's the 7 kilos that I've just shown you in the table. And what we need to think about is whether she can actually eat it. And the thing is, she can. She can eat 7 kilos of dry grass. It's no problem. But if we want to get her to eat a bit more grass, we can feed her some urea. So if we feed a bit of urea, we can actually increase that pasture intake up to about 8.4 kilos. So we'll have a look at what that looks like. So this was our original 7, and then this is the extra she can eat if she gets some urea. So she's up to 8.4. And we have to think about whether she can physically eat it. And yes, she can, which is great. We can get her to eat 8.5 kilos of grass, no dramas. The problem is when we start to think about what her status is. Now, if she's a dry cow and she's in her last trimester of pregnancy, this line here tells you what her requirements are. So her energy requirements, remember, energy is the most important thing first. Her energy requirements are 60 megajoules a day. Now, if she's only eating pasture with some urea, she's only getting 53. So we're not quite filling that gap, but we're pretty close. But to get that 60 megajoules, she's got to eat 9.5 kilos of grass. So let's have a look at what that looks like. So we've now got 3 piles of grass in front of us, all of which equal 9.5 kilos together. And the question is, can she eat that every day? And unfortunately, the answer is no. She can't physically fit that amount of grass, dry grass, in her body cavity. It's not possible. So what we end up with is a deficit. So there's a deficit line here for pasture only, but I'm going to talk about this one here, which is the pasture with urea. So if we look at her requirements and we take off what she's actually getting from the pasture and urea, we've got this deficit of 7. Now, what we can do is if we've got those cows in good body condition, they can manage that deficit no problems, and they can manage it for quite some time. They're pretty amazing like that. So body condition is really, really critical here when we're talking about pregnancy in the dry season. The story changes a little bit if that cow is lactating. So if she's got a calf on her up to about 4 months old, her energy requirements go through the roof. They go from 60 up to 80 megajoules every day. Now, to get 80 megajoules of energy out of this poor grass, she has to eat 12.7 kilos. That's what this looks like. So this is the new pile of grass that's emerged in the front here. So this is what she'd have to eat every single day if she was going to meet her energy requirements. And the thing is, it's impossible. She cannot do it. So we're faced with now an even bigger deficit. So if she's lactating on that dry grass, her requirements are 80 megajoules, she's only getting 53. That means there's a gap here of 27 megajoules. Now again, she can manage that for a little while if she's got body condition. The problem is if she runs out of body condition, so if she's not in good enough nick when she calves on that dry grass and she starts to run out of her body condition, the only way you can fill that gap for her is to start feeding her something that will actually substitute pasture. So we're talking about something like molasses or copra meal or some type of grain, and that's in the order of 2 to 3 kilos of those every single day, just to keep her maintaining that calf on her. And in most people's situations, that would just be incredibly expensive and impractical. So the message here is to really think about what the body condition of a cow is when she's going into that dry season, when you have her calving, so what your time of calving is, and then what you've actually done prior to that to wean her so that affects her body condition. Now, Mick's going to talk a lot more about all of these next week because you can really manage nutrition when you're talking about herd management, which can really reduce the amount of supplement that you might need to feed. So just to summarize what I've covered today, I'm just about at the end here. The first point that we talked about was our cattle food pyramid and our most limiting nutrients. So just remember, energy is the first thing we need to worry about, and then protein. We then talk about phosphorus if you're on deficient country, which a lot of Northern Australia is. And once we've met the energy, protein, and phosphorus requirements of cattle, that's when we start to worry about those other vitamins and minerals. And in most cases, they really aren't a problem. Legumes are nature's supplement. If you've got a pasture that's got a lot of legumes in it and you manage the grazing so that cattle can select legumes and grass when they choose to, it can really shorten up the period that you might need to supplement cattle. Pasture intake is super critical. You need to have a really good understanding of how much grass a cow actually needs to get into her belly every day. And then what pressure that's going to put on your pastures. So something like forage budgeting can really help you. And I mean, that's another topic for a whole nother webinar. You can have a look at the StockTake app. That is a fantastic resource you can use to help forage budgeting. But there's also lots of other forage budgeting resources on the FutureBeef website. Body condition is super critical, and like I said, Mick's going to talk about that more next week, but it's really important to time your herd management and what's happening with bulls coming in and out, cows calving, weaning, all of those things around your seasons and what the pasture is doing, and making sure that you can let the pastures worry about the nutrition of cattle rather than spending a lot of money on supplements. And that's basically because supplements should help cattle eat enough pasture. They shouldn't substitute pasture. We really don't want to fall into a trap where we're spending a lot of money substituting grass with something else. If you want a bit of extra support or information on this topic, the great news is that we're here to help. So like I said, there's lots of information on the FutureBeef website. Alternatively, you can call our DAF call centre and ask to be connected to your local DAF extension officer. We've got nutrition workshops coming up in the next few months. And of course, you can tune into next week's webinar and the webinar after that. And that's all I've got to say. So thank you all for listening, and I'll hand back to you, Greg.